Thank you very much. What an amazing place and what an amazing location. I'm very honored to be here, and what a lovely crowd. And I'm jet lagged. I'm gonna tell you, this is like 1 o'clock in the morning in Denmark, and I'm usually napping at that time. So if I turn into a zombie at one point, it's just me turning into Danish mode. And also when I'm reading this story, The Winter Garden, there probably will be words that I pronounce really horribly, but may I be forgiven. Also, I could tell that there are Danes in the audience, thank God. So if I suddenly lose my English, which I do when I get really tired, my English just goes away, I'll just switch to Danish and you can translate for me. Great. I'm going to read The Winter Garden, one of the stories. It was the first story that I published in the public space with Bridget Hughes. And in the first line, there's a name of a Danish comedian called Dirch Passer. It's like Joe Belushi or something. But we kept all the original names. But he was a legendary Danish comedian. The Winter Garden. It was the night Dirch Passer, the comedian, died. He collapsed on stage. His heart was sick and he was taken away by ambulance to the hospital, where they said he was dead on arrival. It was September 3rd, 1980, and the reason I remember it so well is that it was the night my mother and father decided to tell me that they were getting divorced. This was announced during dinner, and somewhere inside me I think I was relieved. It may sound harsh, but they didn't match, so when Mom told me, all I did was put down my fork. By 10 o'clock the news was out about Dirch Passer. Those two things, his death and me standing by the porch door looking out on the moss Dad always let grow between the paving stones, are inseparable to me. The first year and a half I lived with my mother and visited Dad in his new row house every 2 weeks. He never really got moved in, my father. He slept on a daybed in the big bedroom, and we ate chicken from the hamburger stand when I was there. Then what happened was that Mom found a boyfriend. His name was Henning. He was alone with 2 daughters, and we would sit in the living room playing cards in the evening. My father was sad when I visited him. He kept saying that it didn't matter what I asked him. Nothing, he said. And then I talked to Mom and Henning about it maybe being fair, seeing how Henning's 2 daughters lived with them, that I moved into the spare room at my father's. It was June 6th, 1982. And as we sat in the car outside Dad's house, my mother kept pulling down the sleeves of my jersey and saying that I should know that there was a way back. She stepped inside with me, no more than that, and that was how I got the spare room at my father's. He tried to make the place nice. The furniture was pushed back against the walls, and there was a coffee table with a large ashtray in the living room. He bought bookshelves too, and in his bedroom there was a narrow bed, the same as the one he had put in the spare room for me. My room was all cleaned, and it was plenty big enough. I don't know where he got the drapes from, but he pulled them together so I could see they worked. There were good and bad things that summer I lived with Dad. One good thing was the World Cup in Spain. Paolo Rossi was the top scorer with 6 goals, and the Northern Ireland striker Norman Whiteside was the youngest player ever in the finals at 17 years and 41 days. We watched the games together, Dad and me, and because the sun was beating down outside, we had all the drapes closed. The dark living room, the smell of relish, and the warm television set were good things. But then when we went out together, like to the supermarket, Dad couldn't help but put his arm around my neck to show that we belonged together, though nobody else could care less. Dad had been lucky to get the house, he said, and he was especially happy about the patio enclosure. It would be warm out there in the winter, so Dad filled it up with desert plants and called it the Winter Garden. Whereas the living room, the kitchen, and the bathroom seemed big, the Winter Garden was soft and cozy. Sometimes in the evenings, if there was nothing on television, he would want us to sit out there in garden chairs and talk. He grew succulent plants and onions and fed them with plant food so they grew really big. He had a crassula, as he called it, that was 5 feet tall. I was to have it one day because I happened to say it was the most beautiful. Sometimes to make him happy, I said that the warm earth in the Winter Garden smelled like the jungle. Other times I said his plants were so big he looked like Tarzan when he was standing among them. Then he would laugh and call me Korak. But before he and Mom divorced, He had no hobbies. I could definitely have gone on living with my father, but then what happened was that in the middle of September that year, a divorced lady from my father's work discovered that he was divorced too. Her name was Margaret. I saw her one day out in the winter garden going back and forth with a glass of white wine in her hand, while my father was explaining to her how a succulent plant stored water inside them like camels. I saw how she was looking at the wallpaper in the living room. And then she invited Dad and me to her home one Sunday afternoon. It was September 30th, 1982, the day Dirk Passer's National Health Card would have expired if he had been alive. And the thing I remember most from that day is that this woman, Margaret, had a son. He sat on the couch staring sullenly at me. I stared back to make him stop. He stuck his tongue out at my father when he wasn't looking. That may seem like a petty thing, but it was only then I realized that I was the only person who thought my father was someone special. It was only my way of looking at him that stopped him from being just some ordinary guy of no importance who could be replaced by any other ordinary guy of no importance. If I didn't like him, he would basically be insignificant. And if he were insignificant, things would look pretty bad for me. So I cut everything I felt for my father into pieces and hid them away where best I could. In my thoughts, I mean. Some went underneath the table in the living room. Some went into Margaret's houseplants and into the ugly mouth of her son. That way the boy would have to find it all again before he could stick his tongue out at it. I don't know what happened between my father and this Margaret woman that day, but I never saw her again, and when we left, there was no time for me to put all the pieces I had hidden together again. Outside in the car, where I sat up front, I remember I didn't care to look at my father at first. But then I did anyway, and it was true. There was just a guy driving a car, and I stuck my tongue out at him when he wasn't looking. Thank you.
It's a really good book, by the way. I got it early. I just want to thank Maureen for having us, and Bridget, and this is one of my favorite places. There's a lot of people here considering how cold it is. So thank you guys all for coming, and it's just such a great spot to be here. I will read, let's see, tragic or funny. You know, I see Steve Denon, who I know from Yaddo. So I'm gonna read. So, you know, people are always saying, like, how does I really am a fiction writer, and I write from my imagination. I see John Haskell, also a Yaddo person. I see John Haskell, also a Yaddo person. And so the funny thing is, I really do make up what I write. I don't write from real life at all, hardly, very rarely, very little. And Yaddo is this artist colony in upstate New York where we were just talking about that you should go. And when I'm there, I function like the cruise director. Who was the girl on Love Boat? I'm also trying, Julie. I feel like I'm Julie. I'm always trying to get the people to go do things. So one time there was a place in town near the shopping mall that had laser tag. And it was a place that had actually formerly been a grocery store, and then for a while was a movie theater you went and ate dinner at while it was no longer a grocery store. And then it became this laser tag place. So I thought we should all go play laser tag, something I'd never done in my entire life. And somehow I convinced a whole batch of what I call Yadodians to go play laser tag. And their average age was about, well, I was probably among the younger people. There was somebody maybe in her 70s or 80s who were going to go play laser tag. So it turns out, number one, laser tag is played only by teenage boys. Who knew? And we go, and there's this whole little, like, it was basically like, and you also always feel like there's something about Yaddo, and it's a good thing, but you feel a little mentally ill when you're there. And you're staying in this nice house, and people are cooking your food, and you're working from your imagination. But so when you go into town with a group of them, you feel a little like the short bus coming to town. So anyway, so I take the people there, and they give us the instructions. We put on these vests, and we have our guns, which is, you know, how you play laser tag. And they say one of the things is, you know, no running or shoving. And I'm thinking, right, because we're all prone to that. These artists, excuse me, I'm running here. So we go in, and as we're going into this place, some boy, like, knocks into me and, like, basically almost runs me over. I literally picked him up by the back of his shirt and I go, no running! So this is how that turns into fiction. So this is a spot I'm going to read to you from May We Be Forgiven. It's, I don't know how far it is into the book. It's fairly far into the book, where the main character Harold has started having an affair with this woman who's married, and they've become also quite good friends. So here's a scene that takes place both in fiction but also in Saratoga Springs in my imagination. Tuesday morning, just after 8, the phone rings. "There's someplace I need you to go with me," she says. "What happened to hi, hello, how are you?" "A club," she says. "What about your husband? Can't you get him to take you?" "I can't even get him to go to a movie." "So will you go?" "What is it?" "Like-minded people," she suggests. "A political group?" "Not exactly, more like a social gathering. It's at the laser tag place called Night Vision in the mini mall." "The one with the CVS?" "That's the one. Can we meet in the parking lot?" "Sure," I say. "What's the dress code?" "Casual," she says. Sitting in the car outside of CVS waiting, I considered telling Cheryl about the woman from the A&P. I'm not sure why I feel guilty cheating on a woman who's already cheating on her husband, or why I feel compelled to tell a woman who I have absolutely no relationship or commitment to, yet I'm equally or more uncomfortable keeping it to myself. I'm lost in this peculiar reverie about confession when she taps on the car window, scaring the hell out of me. "You changed your hair," I say, realizing that every time I see her she looks different. Today it's more of a wedge, like Dorothy Hamill, the ice skater. "It's a wig," she says. As we're crossing the parking lot, I begin. "In the interest of full disclosure, don't," she says, and I stop. "I'm a little nervous," she says. "About what?" "I've never been to one of these things before." She pauses. "In the interest of full disclosure," she says, almost mocking me. "I probably should have told you over the phone, but..." "What?" "I'm not sure if everyone will be clothed," she says, not missing a beat. "What?" "I'm just saying." Saying that like it's a nudist party and somehow you didn't want to tell me till now? "I didn't want you to be nervous," she lies. "You didn't want me to say no." She says nothing. "Is nudity required?" I ask. "Optional." "Are you going to get naked?" I ask. She shrugs. "First I want to see what it's like." There's a handwritten sign taped to the door, closed for private party. A table in front of the ticket booth is decorated with a sign that reads, "WelcomeOurFriendsAndNeighbors.org." "May I help you?" a guy in a polo shirt and khakis asks. "I signed up for the event. Cheryl Stevens?" He finds her name on the list and smiles. "And I see you brought a friend. Is that all right?" "Oh, the more the merrier. Have you ever played laser tag before?" "Nope," we both say. The referees will review the rules of the game and instruct you on the use of the vests and guns. It's open bar. $30 covers that. We also have private parties every other week. That's where the fun stuff happens. That's more behind closed doors, private houses, invitation only. Tonight's like more of a meet and greet, a good opportunity to get up to know us and have us get to know you. He smiles. We don the laser outfit, a chest pack with a gun attached on a kind of stretchy leash. One of the referees explains, "Your gun won't fire for 15 seconds after you've been hit. A hit, in effect, turns you off. Just remember, no running, no pushing." As we're heading in, we pass the bar, where a woman in a yellow sports bra with laser gear on top is drinking white wine from a paper cup. I'm expecting both more and less. In my mind's eye, I have images from 1970s sex clubs where half-bald or toupeed men fondle sexually liberated women left, right, and center. By comparison, this seems hairier, fleshier, more juvenile. It may be the laser tag that breaks it down. Here, sweaty men run around in BVDs with toy guns and a cracked reenactment of games played at home when they were 9 or 10. Now the games have been pushed to a newly awkward edge. Their behavior is made creepier by a plethora of body, hair, fat, and the occasional tattoo. Not that I came here as a critic, but I'm amazed at how unattractive the people are, how unashamed. The women have tried a little harder. Some wear arty lingerie or some version of a hooker or hostess costume. Others look like they're about to take off on a bike ride in sports bras and tight shorts, one with the ass cheeks cut away. All of it reads like porn gone wrong and gives me a new appreciation for professionals versus amateurs. I don't want to rain on your parade, but I have to go to the city tomorrow morning and I want to be home at a decent hour, I say to Cheryl. "I let a woman touch me," she says, apparently unaware that I was standing right next to her when it happened. "Was it your first time?" "Yes," she pauses. "She touched me so lightly it tickled." "It sounds like maybe you liked it." "I didn't not like it." "That's what you call a double negative. Do you mean you liked it?" "I wouldn't go that far," she says. "I've got to go," I say. "It's getting late." "Do you have time for coffee?" she asks. "We could debrief." She laughs at her own joke. As we're crossing the parking lot, she says, "Can you believe such a place exists right here, right next to the drugstore, the hospital supply, and the card shop? I buy cards for my mother-in-law in there." Stinking of sweat, some of it other people's, we go to Friendly's. I didn't think you were very into it, she says when we're sitting down. Frankly, I was surprised by how depressing it was. Me too, she says. What can I get you, the waitress asks. Coffee, I say. Is that all? Coffee and apple pie? A la mode, she asks. Yes, please. Coffee and apple pie, Cheryl says. That's like what my grandfather would order. Fine, I say. 80-60 apple pie. I'll have a clown sundae with chocolate ice cream. The waitress leaves and I lean forward. Why did you want to do this? I asked Cheryl, who looks tearful. I'm just really curious, she says. I would think you already know that about me. I want something different, something more. My ice cream arrives and she digs in. You need a job, I suggest. Maybe get a real estate license or go back to school and become a social worker. I got the real estate license, she says. It just means you fuck strangers in other people's houses. Impromptu, she belches. The scent of white wine and chocolate ice cream blasts across the table. Apologies, she says. I don't think I'm supposed to drink while I'm on this new medication. I didn't know you were on a new medication, I say, sobering up. Oh yeah, a whole new regime. Do you think maybe the medication prompted this thing tonight? How do you know it's what you actually want to do and not some strange side effect? I don't think the desire to explore a swingers club is listed under side effects, she says. Like I said, I'm curious. Is that a bad thing? And honestly, I like the idea of having sex with some guy and not having to do his laundry or make his lunch and shop for his socks. Can I get you anything else, the waitress asks. Just the check, I say, noticing now that several people from the couples from the party have come into Friendly's, pink-cheeked and laughing too loud. And that's the auto fiction, all made up. So now Bridget and Dorothy are going to come up, and we're going to talk about all kinds of things. So watch us climb onto the stage.
I just want to say thank you again to everyone at Center for Fiction and to all of you for joining us tonight. The novelist Fiona Mizell was at a residency in rural Denmark about 2 years ago and emailed us from there about writers she said we had to immediately go out and read. And we published Dorthe's first story shortly thereafter in the magazine. And then last year when we launched a public space books with Grey Wolf Press, we knew that we wanted Dorthe's story collection to be the first book that we published. And it's had, I have to say, a really sort of charmed arrival into the world. We've had a wonderful time sort of culminating in bringing Dorthe to New York for a series of events, and having AM join us tonight at the Center for Fiction just feels very special for the book, so thank you very much for being part of this.
Fiona is also a Yaddo writer.
I know, I feel like the next time somebody tells me they're going to Yaddo, I'm going to picture them. A little different something will come to mind. I thought maybe just to even things out, I would ask Dorthe about the source material for her stories, because I know that you've talked about this book as coming out of a period in your life when you were doing a lot of traveling around and collecting stories, and that this book for you was sort of a logbook of that point in your life.
Yeah, I was very poor. So like all young writers are. So I lived in grand houses. I lived in places where I wouldn't pay rent for a while. And now in 2006 I had 6 different addresses, and it was driving me crazy. So I moved to Copenhagen and I stayed there for like 7 years, recently moved. But what I found out was that the places I stayed in those years started popping up in these stories. I don't think people can actually tell necessarily. In some stories they can, but I can tell because there is a sense of space, a sense of geography in all these stories. So it's like a logbook, like a diary to me. I know exactly what spot on the earth I was thinking of when I wrote this, and what experience and during those years that I sort of put into that story. So definitely a logbook.
Yeah. So space more than, I mean, I'm thinking of a story like The Buddhist, which is this wonderful...
yeah. Well, there is a space behind that,
and
yes.
Is there a person?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, that's also when you travel and you have a period in your life where you meet a lot of people, and not all of them are good, and not all of them are sane. And it's just fun picking up on that, and you totally fictionalize it afterwards. You know, it's like that thing she just explained, you know, you just stir it up, and a lot of fiction. And yes, I know the Buddhist for real. Yeah, interesting person.
So I was thinking about sort of topics that, ways in which your writing is similar and ways in which it was different. And A.M. is often described as sort of a quintessential American novelist. And I'm wondering both if you can talk about how you define that for yourself, and then also for you, Dorthe, if you think of, or if you are considered sort of a quintessential Danish writer, and what that would mean for your work.
You first?
Quintessential American writer. I think that's true, whatever it means. I think that, you know, one of the things that I spend a lot of time looking at is sort of ideas about the American dream and about family and the sense of both kind of a post World War II America that was about the kind of the what became an entitlement, or the assumption that you would have these things if you kind of even worked modestly hard. You would get a car and some houses and some children and some cars and more houses and grass and different things would come to you. And I think that for me comes out of both out of American history and out of sort of the history of contemporary literature, looking at writers like Richard Yates and John Cheever and people like that, and sort of reflecting on that. But I think I also, well, I don't have it in that book, in my book, this one. That one. They Would Be Forgiven. I also really wanted to write, and it's when I had to look it up, the great American novel, which doesn't mean, by the way, the really good American novel. It means the large American novel. And I think that that's been part of our history, and I wanted to sort of look at the idea of things unfolding, and I think I write about sort of shifts in culture that are very American, and consumerism in a way that's very American. And what it actually also means a lot to me is my books come out in a lot of other countries, and I secretly love, almost more than what they do here, that they're translated not only to the other languages, but that there's a resonance in other cultures. So when someone's like, oh, I just read the Romanian edition of your book, I find that incredibly moving. And there was one, the book before this, I'm blanking on what it was called, This Book Will Save Your Life, was known as the donut book in England because it came out with all these donuts on the cover. And when it was published in Korea, they called and said they wanted to put a Dunkin' Donuts coupon in the book, and Andrew Riley, my agent, said, absolutely not, we do not put coupons in books. And I said, let them put a coupon in the book. Like, I thought, what a cool, weird idea, that all of a sudden there's Dunkin' Donuts and me together for one day only. So that, to me, even is a very American gesture, even though it was happening. And I don't even know that people in Korea got Dunkin' Donuts. I mean, so all that to say, I do think that I'm, in the best of ways and worst of ways, very much an American writer. And
was Nixon in the novel from the beginning? Yes. He was always part of it.
Yeah, I weirdly am fascinated by Nixon, which doesn't mean that I love Nixon I find him just the most kind of amazing, the pathology and the psychology of like such a bitter guy, and he hated everybody, and he held a grudge, and he became president, and he had no friends. How did that happen? You know, it's also even the shift in culture of how, you know, and then we noticed that at the last set of presidential debates, I don't know if any of you remember the constant conversation of it's 63 degrees in the debate room. That came from the Nixon-Kennedy debates, which Nixon was so upset by because he sweated through his makeup and he had been sick and he looked horrible. People who heard the debate thought Kennedy won when they heard on the radio. People who watched it, people who heard the debate thought Nixon won. People who watched it thought Kennedy won. But there were no presidential debates until like 15 or 20 years later, because no one would do it after that experience. So it's a relatively new concept. And now, just to add on to that, we have the idea that what you see at the debate is entirely the construction of the TV network that's broadcasting it. It's not. It's the whole idea that you'll look at like Obama or Romney, and they show you these like shots of like, you know, Americans. It's all constructed because it's who they're choosing to focus. But we lost track of that too. So all that to say, I'm very interested in American culture.
And what would a Danish sort of sensibility?
I think this is very Scandinavian. I think I'm very Scandinavian, but I think it's a mixture. I'm going to give you a lesson in Scandinavian literature now. I think it's a mixture between the best of the Swedish tradition and some of the Danish tradition. And the Swedish that I have picked up, because I studied Swedish at university. So it's Strindberg, and I'm going to give you a bunch of names you probably don't know now. A woman called Kerstin Ekman, P.O. Enquist, and it's Selma Lagerlöf, and it's Ingmar Bergman, and guys like that. And what's special about that Swedish tradition is the courage to stare into darkness without closing your eyes and just keep on staring, because it's dark most of the year up there. You know, they spend a lot of time staring into the forest and going, what's the meaning of life? And that's really, that can become very horrible in Swedish literature. Also, you almost want to commit suicide sometimes after reading, you know, that really black kind of looking at existence. But the courage of that to actually look at the structures of existence and don't turn from it, but dare that, combined with the Danish tradition that is lighter, that has a lot of irony, a sense of humor, and you can see that my book is very thin. And that has also something to do with Danish aesthetics, because there is a certain kind of Danish literature that can be compared to Danish design. It's like we cut away all the unimportant stuff. We go to the core of the form. We want to have the precision of the artwork. We want the cool lines of the chair, the cool line of things. So I think that whole aesthetic feeling of, somebody would say minimalist. Somebody has said that I was minimalist, but the combination with that Swedish volume of existence sort of bursts through that minimalism in my stories. I think people pick up on that. That's why they get moved, even though it's very small and very confined and very precise. So I'm Swedish in my heart and I'm Danish in my brain. Is that it? I don't know.
So the great Danish book would be a compressed thing, and the great American book would be big and expensive.
So there are big Danish books too, but the whole tradition about writing, you know, it's like hunting the white whale, right? You know, writing that novel in America. We don't have that in Denmark. We just want to make money on crime fiction. Basically it.
When we go into the darkness, I have to say, we take our donuts, we take our iPad, we take our flashlight, we take, like, you know, we have go bags. That's what we have. It's like, that's my go bag. Those are go cups, and we're like also like, there's always an American panic that there won't be snacks at the next time. That's true. No, in no other country do you see that. Like, you know, even in the airport, we hoard. It's fascinating. That's true.
Can I ask both of you about the humor in your stories and the way it works, and is it sort of how it balances with sort of the dark in your work?
When I read this, I actually felt that we were kindred spirits, because we kind of do the same thing but in different ways. Mm-hmm. Because there's also the courage to actually stare into the abyss in this great book, but then it cracks you up the next 2 pages further down the road. You're crying from laughter. But the whole thing about switching from one emotion to the other is very smart, because when you get people to laugh and then you turn on them, then suddenly they're tearful, and you get to touch them in places where it's good to be touched, I think, and I recognize that in your...
See, we are kindred spirits, because I was going to say
are.
exactly. That I think the humor lets you go deeper. Exactly. That it actually sort of... That the relief of the humor lets you get much more serious, and lets you talk about things that are very difficult to talk about, that are painful.
Yeah. Because you can sort of trick the story into that space, or you prepare the reader for it, or... I think that there is truly the notion of comic relief. There is an outlet for it, and there is a release of kind of that pent-up feeling. And I think that it's not a trick at all, but it has its purposes. And I also think the truth is that life, you know, I have European ancestry, is dark and it is complicated. And I think if you can't find the humor or the irony in it, it becomes at times unbearable. So the humor allows you to bear what is otherwise very difficult.
There's also the other way around. If you make people laugh or smile on one page, and they feel comfortable, and then you present them for something that is very hard on the next page, they're going, oh, I can take this now, because I know she's going to sort of caress me in a couple of pages. It's like and it's not a trick, you're right, it's just like, that's the way it's good to be with people. You can share both, I think. It has an effect. and it's not what do you call it, escapism?
Escapism,
It's
right.
escapism when you
Yeah.
when you make them laugh.
No,
It's just
it's,
a way of sort of comforting the reading process of hard things.
I would also say, honestly, for me as a writer with this particular book, I wrote it at a time where I thought publishing is not in particularly good shape. And I wanted to make myself laugh. I mean, I thought, like, I'm just gonna actually write the book that I want to write and the book I'd like to read. And things would happen and I would think, that's kind of funny. And I would think, can I leave it in there? And I just thought, screw it, I'm leaving it in there. You know, which sometimes you go like, oh, that's too funny, or that's too, you know, or you're being whatever, you know. But I just sort of thought all bets are off anyway. Publishing's like, you know, so why not?
Always dying.
Well, yeah.
Maybe I'll ask one more question and then open it up to the audience for a minute, so I don't take up all the time. To go sort of from the opposite side, from the humor to the sort of the darkness and the violence, and I'm trying to figure out how I want to phrase this question. Sort of, what in your work do you think has a recognizably sort of female sensibility?
Oh my God.
Or do you think of yourselves as a woman writer, as a
I just think of myself as a writer.
I think that's a really, see, we are kindred. I think, you know, there's constant ongoing debate about women writers and that women writers don't get reviewed as much and all things that are true. But I think of myself as a writer, and I find it insulting when someone's like, and woman writer. The other day I was sitting someplace actually in a restaurant, sort of working on the weekend, and it was fairly crowded and whatever. So some man comes over and he goes, do you mind if I sit here and eat my oysters at your table? And I said, that's fine. He goes, well, you're working on the weekend. I was like, and I'm thinking, you're talking to me while I'm working. So either you're in my book or you're out of my book. You're gonna have to decide. I said, yes, I am. He said, oh. And he said, well, what do you do? And I said, I'm a writer. He goes, oh, I'll tell my wife. And I actually was like, I said, why would you tell your wife? Oh, well, she's in a book club and I'm not. And I said, well, you know, my last book would be really good for you. And I said, and the one before that. I said, they're both about a guy. And he goes, a guy who kind of wants it all, but has it all and wants more? I'm like, exactly. It was really interesting. I finally, this room was like sweating, and he's like, ah! Scared him away. I got my table back. But I find that, I find that always interesting. That there always is this assumption that someone's like, oh, you know, that somehow, and the writer Grace Paley, who was a teacher of mine, really said it, I think, incredibly eloquently, which was that women had always done men the favor of reading their books, and men had not returned the favor. Because I think it's a ridiculous assumption that if you're really writing, and you're not writing, you know, there is such a thing as chick lit, and there are things that are sort of designed to be read, I guess, in a way, by certain people. But if you're really writing what we think of as literature, you're writing books for everybody, and they're not gender, you know, specific. So I find that insulting. On both of our behalves.
Exactly.
Anyway.
Yeah. Should we open it up to the audience for a moment before
we ask
I
you
take
guys
up all the
questions.
time?
Before we start asking you questions.
No questions? Oh, yes.
I have tons of questions that I keep thinking of that, you said that Grace Paley was a teacher.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit? I mean, you probably have volumes to say about it, but how she influenced your writing, like the most, or like what was the
Sure. How Grace influenced my writing the most. Okay, you're right. There's several volumes. I think I'll just pick one. Grace, a couple things. One is that she actually said to me at one point, I was very young, she said, you're getting by because you're very clever, and that's not good enough. And she was totally right, because I was writing things that were perfectly okay, but I wasn't going deep enough and going far enough, so that helped. And then the other piece of it is that she really taught me a lot about revising. And she was always a very careful writer, and she always had, like, literally she would have a story in her purse, and it would always just be something hanging out of her purse with, like, you know, gum in it and all kinds of other things. She was very, very typically Grace. But, you know, with handwriting all over it, and I very much, I think that revision obviously is an incredibly important piece of it, but she was really about the words and the lines and very specific. So she taught me, I guess, you know, the biggest thing was to raise my expectation and standard for myself. Which is a very difficult thing to teach somebody, because often when you're working with students, they go, I finished my story, And you think, oh, how many drafts did you do? And they go, well, I just finished it. And you're like, okay, you just gave me, a nothing at the moment. So she was great.
Thank you.
Sure.
Well, you both talked about humor and staring into the darkness, and those are both incorporated in your work. I was wondering, I'm not quite sure my question. How do you, you don't set out to write the humor, you don't set out to write the humor in your stories, do you? Or does it come naturally as part of telling the story? Or do you go, well, I need a funny part here, so, how does that work?
It better come naturally, because there's nothing worse than forced jokes. It has to be part of your voice. It has to be part of what you are. And you don't write from your brain. At least you don't write from your brain if you want to write well. You write from your stomach, and then you just have your brain help you out now and then. You meet people at parties who try to tell jokes in the corner, and you always avoid them. And that's the same thing with literature. If you try to do that in your books, it's not going to work.
So it's part of your personality, because not every writer goes to the funny place that it turns out that it becomes humorous. It's part of you.
I think, yes, it's part of us, because now we're twins, actually. But I think the other piece is it also comes out of the character. It's got to be organic to the character. There's and that's, in a way, that's the fun part and the best part of writing, is when something happens, whether tragic or comic or whatever, that catches you off guard as a writer. You think, God, I didn't see that coming. And it really means at that point that those characters are animated. Like a lot of the stuff in the laser tag, I played laser tag, but we were not naked. Exactly. A lot of that stuff just sort of happens, and you think, or even the notion that that they go to Friendly's and he orders the clown sundae, which to me is hysterically funny and also kind of pathetic, right? But he's clearly making a gesture. When that happens, it's just it's a moment that tells you you're really in that character and it's really happening. But if you try to apply yourself and your values and your judgment onto a character, it doesn't work. It's so much about who's there in that story, and what's funny to them and funny in one story does not work in another story.
Which is the magic of writing.
Yeah.
Because you don't actually know how it's done. It just happens sometimes. You can do a lot of things to make it happen, but when you're in the zone, it just kind of happens. Yeah.
But I think the humor in your stories is also very different than a joke. Reading both of your work, I could read the same scene on Monday when I'm in this mood and find it very, very funny, and read it again on Thursday when I'm in a different mood and find myself sort of,
Actually, the novel I wrote before I wrote this one was about sorrow, and it took me 3 years to write, and it was horrible getting up in the morning, going to the computer and go, oh, bloody hell, I'm going to write about sorrow today. It turned out to be a very good book, but when it was published, I decided that the next book I was going to write, it had to be fun for me to sit at the computer. I wanted to go and have fun at my desk. So I sort of loosened the grip on the serious Swedish stuff and just let the fun stuff come out.
I take a medication for that.
Yeah.
This afternoon on NPR National Public Radio, there was another Scandinavian author. I believe it was his third book and maybe the first one translated into English as well. And I wondered if you think there's
Is his name Christian Jungersen?
Yes.
Christian, he's sitting right there. I kind of figured it out.
Excellent.
It had to be. And his book is called You Disappear.
So I want to know if you think there's going to be a new popularity in America with Scandinavian.
Yes.
Besides the murder mysteries that you mentioned.
Yeah, well, the murder mysteries are just kind of, it's like a tsunami.
Yeah.
I hope so, because there is a lot of good literature in Scandinavia, and also literary fiction going on, and books that want to try out other things than just killing people. And also show that, because it's very, when I read this, and we are kindred spirits, I can also tell that we're from very different cultures. And isn't it just great you can read literature that has different voices and different voids and different approaches to things, you know? Because American literature is also Fiona Marceau, it cracks me up. I'm laughing constantly when I'm reading it. And it's a very different approach to it. But the Scandinavian literature has this sort of, winterish darkness to it. So I hope so. And how fun that Christian was
It's right there.
Yeah.
You know, one sort of footnote,
Undercover in the audience.
one sort of footnote to that to
So
add.
you were on the radio today? Cool.
10 years ago, Penn founded the International Writers Festival, and part of why Salman Rushdie founded that festival was because we realized that only 3% of books published in this country were books published in translation from other countries. When you go to European countries, you see many, many more books in translation from all over the world, and that there truly is a global and international literature. And in this country, mostly we don't know the names of who are the interesting, writers in other places. And it happens when I'm on tour. People always say, oh, who are you reading from our country? And I think, no one, which is so embarrassing. And so all that to say, the Penn Festival brings writers. It happens again in May. It'll be the 10th anniversary. And really part of that was to raise the awareness of writers in other countries, in books in translation. And there's lots of different translation programs around the city too, because we've got to do better. We're glad you're here.
We're hoping for a wave of good Scandinavian literature. I'm sorry about
you brought the
all
weather.
the murders. All the rapes that we've been sending this way. It's terrible. It's horrible, horrible.
In the
Speaking of Scandinavian literature, have either of you read Carl Lee Nausgaard's,
My Struggle.
My Struggle, plus he wrote, I think, 4 more.
Oh, Knausgård. Yeah.
Knausgaard, okay, that's it.
Knausgård? That's what they call him in Norwegian.
Okay,
Yes, I read it.
what's your impression?
I think he's one of the brightest writers of our neck of the woods. And I wouldn't toy with what he's doing at home, because it takes an incredibly good writer to actually write 6 books about your own underwear and stuff like that. It takes, it would be so horrible in a creative writing class to have a student try that. I would jump out the window immediately. But Knausgård is just so incredibly eloquent and smart.
He is good.
And then it's like you read the first book and you go, and he had this idea, I don't want this edited. I want people to see the faults that I do, which is pretty weird, right? It's also they have a lot of oil money in Norway, so they can actually afford publishing them. But then you get 200 pages into the first volume, and then it's just the most beautiful, beautiful narrative about a drunk father. 200 pages of pure epic. And when you read those 6 books, it's like, oh, there's 200 pages of crap here. But then suddenly you can tell how art just flows out of that badness. It's really, I like Knausgård. I think it's good.
Talking about translations, you are the quintessential American writer. When you do book tours around the world, for example, the story that you read to us, do you think they get the gist of it, that in Korea or Romania, what do they know about laser tag?
I think it's a good question. I don't know what they know about laser tag, and I've gotten some very, very funny questions from translators where they'll say, when you write opera, do you mean Oprah? And I'm thinking, no. And then I got one from Germany, what is S&M? I'm thinking, you invented it! I think part of it is, that a couple things. One is that translation really is an art. It's not the act of just finding the same word in another language. So in essence, a writer who translates your work, if they're doing it well, in some ways is rewriting your work, because it has to be ever so slightly cast in a way that it can be read in that language and in that culture. Even in I forgot what country it was, but they called me and said, like, we have to change your name, because somehow, I don't even remember where it was, but it was like, AM somehow means female genitalia in our country, and so now you're EM. And I was like, okay, So I think it's a very interesting question and a very interesting process. I've also had things where they'll send me the cover of what the book is. And one of them, they sent me a picture of, somehow it was me holding an American flag in flames around my body. Well, this could be a problem. And then another time they sent me one where I said, oh, why is there a woman in her underwear on the cover of the book? Or no, I said, why is there a woman in a bathing suit on the cover of the book? And they go, oh no, she's not in a bathing suit, she's in her underwear. I'm like, oh great, that helps. So I think it's interesting how, literally how a book is presented, and often I will actually ask one of my other translators if there really is this translation community, and they'll say, oh, the Hungarian is actually really good, because they'll send it to me and I think, I don't read these languages. I'm horribly American and limited in those ways, which is I think a very American thing too, is to not be very fluent in other languages. So the hope is that it does, I mean, from the reactions I get, there is a sense that it does translate and resonate, but I think at the same time, and part of it too is you look at, there's so much American culture and movies that is exported. So I think that things like laser tag on the one hand, maybe not so easily understood, but I think in terms of imagery that people have seen, they've probably seen similar things, so they can kind of piece it together. But it's a good question. I keep thinking too that I should write a book in another language and do it in another country, which is a whole other problem I have to deal with.
Most of the time it's not a problem. All the things that are exotic to Americans in my stories we kept, because it doesn't really matter in the reading process if you don't know where Frederiksberg Gardens is, and if you don't know who Dirk Passer is, or it doesn't matter. And actually all the stories that were set in Denmark and had exotic things and things that people didn't know about were all sold to American magazines like that, no problem. But the two stories set in New York were the last to be sold out here, because you can, there's so many stories about New York and they don't want to be bothered with that anymore, right? But those stories were interesting in Denmark, because people are actually curious about other places and things that they don't know, which is nice, I think.
I'm going to France tomorrow if anyone wants to come.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about, the darkness. You're talking about darkness and violence in Scandinavian countries, but it's part of the social changes that are going on in Scandinavia, the assassinations, Palma, and in Norway. I mean, so I don't understand why you're sort of putting that aside.
Why we're putting the darkness aside?
No, why denigrating it being written about?
Why I don't like it being written about?
No, well, it seems that there are roots for this, and there are causes for this.
For the crime fiction? I think there was originally, in Sweden, after the Palma murder, there was a Sjöwall crime fiction that was really dealing with political changes in the community up there. Danes have not written crime fiction for that long, so but it's primarily a Swedish thing. But when something becomes very popular and people start making money off it, it will turn into something that people will do for money, and that perverts it. I met Kerstin Ekman, who used to be a Swedish crime writer, last year, and she stopped writing crime fiction, and she told me, I'm so sad to read the crime fiction that we write now, because it's perverted. It dwells on perversions, and that is not dealing with conflicts of a country or political issues or the structure of society. That's something else, and I kind of agree with her. People do things for money, bad things sometimes, I think.
Thank you.
Did you have a question?
Well, I have one more question I'll ask Ann Holmes. I think I'll ask her a question, she'll probably just say no, and that's the end of it. But,
Oh, good, I
I think it's true that Don DeLillo kept popping up in this book, I think, and also that in White Noise, the protagonist was expert in Hitler studies, so I
Right.
think we moved it to Nixon.
Right.
Were you actually thinking of White Noise at all when you're writing this and satirizing it, or, no, you can say no now. Then it's over.
Well, you're leaving me not a lot of options, not a lot of wiggle room. Don DeLillo is in the book, and part of why he's in the book is a couple things. One is I wasn't thinking overtly of White Noise, but obviously I know the reference, and enjoyed the parallel of the Hitler studies professor with my Nixon studies professor, so it's not unconscious. You'll also notice that Rick Moody appears in the novel as the financial advisor. Hiram P. Moody, that's Rick Moody's real name. This book in particular, again, in that sense for myself of I wanted to have fun, there's also a law firm that George Plimpton's in. There's a whole bunch of like crazy things in there. So it's filled with all kinds of references. And I really, really admire DeLillo a lot. And also in my imagination, the part of Westchester County where this book is set is where Don DeLillo lives. So it was entirely, and he knows that, it's entirely plausible. The actual locations are real. And so when he's at that Starbucks, we know what Starbucks that is, and where he's, where it's plausible for him to be in that hardware store, he could be in that hardware store. So those things are that funny. And I have to say the other thing that's a real tip of the hat to him is DeLillo works with the combining of fact and fiction and history and fiction, and that is increasingly of interest to me. So whether it's Libra or Underworld, there's a lot of the stuff about Nixon that's in this book is true. It's fact-based. Even the Nixon short stories, which Nixon did not write short stories, are based on things that happened to Nixon or where Nixon was at specific points in time. And also the weird guy who gives all that information, who's sort of like the tip-off person, that's based on information about Nixon and the Kennedy assassination, all the stuff that has come out since the White House special files were seized and are slowly being released. So it's weirdly fact-based, and then the imagination. So that's the DeLillo bit.
Actually, I have to tell you that when I was in the airport in Copenhagen, I was this close to buying a tin of Danish butter cookies.
Oh, I love it.
Didn't have room in my luggage for it.
I didn't know they sold them there. I thought it was only something that was sold here. It's a Danish butter cookie.
No, they're like piles at the airport in Copenhagen.
That's so funny. I now like suddenly have got the worst craving for the one with like the circular one. You know, they're like the box of the Danish butter cookies. You know which one. There's the one with the like sugar granules on top, and there's the plain butter one with nothing on it. And there's which one next? And weirdly, it's funny to say the paper is too noisy because you can't sneak it well. It's like the one where your mother asks, "What are you doing?" You're like, it's like it needs to have more of a tissuey quality as opposed to the crispy quality of the little white things that the cookies are sitting in, because you cannot steal them without being noticed.
I should have bought that.
I know.
A big one.
That's very funny. It's funny too how visual and like your mind is just like it goes immediately to the whole experience of the Danish butter cookie. Oh, so let's not end that.
The Danish butter cookies were a nice place to end it. One last one.
Don't all raise your hands.
Okay. No one else is, I don't know. In taking the, like, you say you both, like, use incidents in reality or people, places, etc. from reality, and then imagination. And this is probably an unanswerable question in this time, but could you talk a little about the process of taking like those bits of reality or the setting of like the shark and the heron, things like that, taking those bits of reality and then moving into a story, a fiction?
Well, like the heron, which was in the New Yorker, was set in, it's basically the route I walked every day when I lived in Copenhagen. And then one day there was this certain place at the Damhus Pond where they feed birds, and there was an old man standing there, and it stinks because those birds, they crap on the ground, and it stinks. It's like, and he was standing in the middle of all that bird dew, and I thought, why is he standing there? What is this? And then that just started rolling. And also the heron in the end of that story, sitting on the bench, is a heron I met in the garden one February morning, very dark, gray, Scandinavian winter day, and I think it was dying. But it was a very, very clear image of something. And I don't know how it happens, but it happens in almost all my stories. I put these incidents together and they give something to each other. I sometimes, just for the fun of it, I will take two completely different things that I know or that I have experienced or seen, and then put them together in a certain, what will they do for each other? And it turns into fiction, it's not me walking there, it's not me having these stories about exploding mothers or something. It is this man on the corner, but you know, I don't know. It's magic. Yeah, we shouldn't, and maybe we shouldn't explain too much how it happens, as long as it just happens.
I will tell you, if you go to Yaddo, there is a famous heron at Yaddo who, inevitably, when you're walking around the dark lakes at Yaddo in the winter, it just takes off flying in front of you. It's a timed thing that as soon as you go around the corner, it just goes. It's
Also,
incredibly beautiful.
There's a man in Frederiksberg Garden who claims he can talk to the birds. He's actually famous for it. When he walks, all the herons in the Frederiksberg Garden will walk after him. He says it's because he communicates with them. I think it's because of the herons in his bag, but yeah.
I'm going to see the park in a few weeks.
Oh,
I'm
it's
just
great.
hoping I can see
Go there. I
that.
miss
See the
it.
herons.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.